What if the real power behind global strategy wasn't politics, wasn't leadership, but geography itself? Long before modern nations existed, before borders were drawn, nature had already decided what was easy and what was nearly impossible. In places like Tibet, surrounded by the towering Himalayas, entire regions were shaped not by governments, but by elevation, isolation, and access. Mountains blocked movement, rivers redirected expansion, and distance slowed empires for centuries. But here's the question. When a region is hard to reach, does it become less important or more valuable? Because in global strategy, the land doesn't just sit there quietly. It influences decisions, power, and even conflict. And some of those geographic realities are still shaping global power today.
This is not just a story about landscapes. This is a story about how geography quietly influenced global strategy long before politics caught up. Because in history, the most important decisions are often shaped not by what leaders choose, but by what the land allows or prevents. And in regions where movement is difficult, strategy begins to form in silence, centuries before the world notices. For centuries, China's geography acted as both protection and limitation. To the west, vast mountain ranges created natural distance and separation. The Himalayas, stretching across Asia, formed one of the most difficult natural barriers on Earth. These were not just mountains, they were obstacles to armies, to trade, and to communication routes. Empires expanded where movement was possible, and slowed where nature resisted. That meant certain regions remained largely isolated, including the high plateau of Tibet, a place where extreme altitude, thin air, and harsh terrain limited access for centuries. But isolation does not mean insignificance, because in global strategy, the most inaccessible regions often carry the highest strategic value. For much of history, these regions remained distant from centralized power. Difficult terrain meant slower administration, limited infrastructure, and fewer direct connections. But over time, the strategic value of these landscapes began to change. What was once seen as remote became essential. Control of high ground meant visibility, control of borders meant security, and control of access routes meant influence. As global powers began to think beyond immediate borders, these regions became part of a larger strategic calculation, not just for China, but for other nations observing closely, including the United States. Because in modern strategy, distance is no longer absolute protection. It becomes a variable that must be managed. And this is where the story begins to shift. Because once geography becomes strategy, it no longer stays silent. In the next part, we'll explore how these landscapes moved from isolation to global attention, and why decisions made decades ago continue to influence the present. In the beginning, these landscapes were distant, difficult to reach, hard to control. But over time, distance stopped being protection and started becoming strategy. For centuries, Regions like Tibet were defined by isolation. High altitude, thin air, limited access routes. These were natural conditions that shaped how people lived, but they also shaped how power moved. Empires traditionally expanded through plains and rivers, not mountains, because mountains slow everything down. Armies move slower, supplies become harder to carry, communication breaks down. So for a long time, these regions remained outside direct control. But history doesn't stay still. As technology improved and global awareness expanded, isolation started to look different. What once looked like distance began to look like advantage, because controlling a difficult place means controlling access itself. By the 20th century, the way nations thought about geography began to change. It was no longer just about expansion. It became about positioning. High ground meant visibility. Remote regions meant buffer zones. Difficult terrain meant natural defense. And suddenly, places that were once ignored became important, very important. In areas surrounding the Himalayas, geography started influencing not just local decisions, but international ones. Because borders in these regions were not just lines on a map, they were shaped by mountains, rivers, and access routes. And once borders become complex, they become sensitive. As global powers expanded their focus, these landscapes entered a new phase. They were no longer just remote regions. They became part of a larger conversation. A conversation about influence, security, and long-term positioning. Nations began to study geography differently, not just where resources were, but how movement worked, where access was possible, and where it could be controlled. Even distant countries like the United States started to view these regions through a strategic lens, because in modern geopolitics, you don't always need to be close to be affected. And this is where the story becomes more complex, because once multiple powers start paying attention to the same landscape, it stops being just geography. It becomes influence, and influence is rarely uncontested. In the next part, we'll move from geography to decisions, from landscapes to strategy in action, and how these regions became part of a much larger global equation. Up to this point, geography has been shaping possibilities, but possibilities alone don't change history. Decisions do. And in the 20th century, those decisions began to take form. After World War II, the world entered a different phase. Power was no longer just regional. It became global. Nations were no longer thinking only about borders. They were thinking about influence, long-term influence. And in that shift, geography took on a new meaning. Regions near the Himalayas and areas like Tibet became part of a much larger calculation, not because of what they produced, but because of where they were. For the United States, distance was no longer a limitation. Advances in technology,
communication, and transportation made global strategy possible and necessary. From a strategic perspective, remote regions were no longer ignored. They were studied. Because influence is not always direct. Sometimes it's about positioning, understanding where power can expand, where it can be limited, and where it can be observed, even without physical presence.
In modern geopolitics, control is not always about occupation. It's about leverage. Geography can act as leverage. Mountain ranges can slow movement, limit access, create natural boundaries. And when those boundaries matter, they become part of strategic thinking. This is where landscapes stop being passive. They start influencing decisions. Because when multiple powers focus on the same region, even silence becomes meaningful. Even distance becomes relevant. And this is where things become more complicated. Because strategy is not static, it evolves. As technology improves, as priorities change, the importance of geography changes too. What was once distant can suddenly become central. What was once ignored can become critical. And when that happens, decisions are no longer simple. They become layered, calculated, and sometimes unresolved. So now, the question is no longer what these landscapes are, but what they have become. Because once geography enters global strategy, it doesn't go back to being neutral. In the final part, we'll explore the long-term consequences and why this story is still unfinished. By now, the pattern is clear. These landscapes were never just remote places. They were shaping decisions long before those decisions became visible. What begins as geography does not stay geography. It becomes policy, strategy, and long-term positioning. Regions once considered distant now sit at the center of global attention. Areas around the Himalayas and regions like Tibet continue to influence how nations think, plan, and respond. Because geography doesn't change quickly, but the way we respond to it does. Most decisions are not made in public. They are shaped quietly over time, through analysis, through observation, through long-term planning. And often, the public only sees the outcome, not the process, not the years of calculation behind a single move. This is why some of the most important parts of history feel invisible. So the question is no longer why these regions matter, but how much they influence what comes next. Because in a connected world, geography is no longer local. Its impact is global, and its consequences are shared, even by countries far away, including the United States. The mountains are still there. The borders are still there. The landscapes have not moved, but the meaning behind them continues to evolve, and the decisions connected to them are still being made, quietly, carefully, and sometimes without being fully understood. because history doesn't always end when events are over. Sometimes it continues in the background, unseen, unresolved, and unfinished. If this story made you think, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments, because some stories are still being written. What begins as geography does not stay geography. It becomes policy, strategy, and long-term positioning. Regions once considered distant now sit at the center of global attention. Areas around the Himalayas and regions like Tibet continue to influence how nations think, plan, and respond. Because geography doesn't change quickly, but the way we respond to it does.